to spend a few minutes providing a status report, and it is just that, a status report, on the current budget process for the next biennium. I want to do this in three parts. First, I'll provide some background on the construction of the budget, and we'll follow that immediately with a description of the Indiana State budget process and our status to date. Then I've asked Jim Allman to provide a status on the development of the budget with respect to planned cost constraints and reductions. What you see here, emblematic of that, is the past decade's history on the appropriation process, and you can see a steady decline in the appropriation. While there are some variations around it, there's about a 1% per year reduction, and I think that's what the President will be talking about later. Finally, I've asked Ken Sandel to provide a brief discussion of where we stand with understanding our specific needs for repair and rehabilitation and where the process stands with respect to funding for that. Well, there's been a lot of discussion recently in the state about the cost of health care. We won't be focusing on that at all at this point as we await the results of our own Blue Ribbon Healthcare Committee, which will be reporting out its findings and recommendations in just a few short weeks. So we'll be sharing a lot of data and details on process and content, and the charts contain considerable detail. I'd ask that you not worry about taking notes, though. We'll be posting this whole presentation on our website for your information. And so you can just relax and try to understand what we're talking about. Ask questions if you'd like. Let me begin with the overall Purdue system budget. The total operating budget from all fund sources is $2.2 billion. You can see the breakdown of it here with $1.8 billion associated with Purdue West Lafayette. For the balance of this presentation, we'll be focusing on the West Lafayette component of the budget, not because the rest is unimportant, it's very important, but the factors that affect the various campuses are different, and discussing all of the elements would require more time than we have available here this morning. I might add, though, that the budget process for the regional campuses is identical to that of the West Lafayette campus, and their appropriations are considered individually and separately from that of West Lafayette. This next chart shows how the $1.8 billion at West Lafayette is broken down by fund source. What this display shows is that the general fund, which is the portion of the budget that funds the teaching mission of the university, constitutes approximately half of the total. The balance of the funding is derived from other sources. Restricted funds are those that are derived from grants, contracts, and gifts that have specific purposes designated by the provider of the funds. So this would include the federal and state governments that support research and donors who specify the use of funds. Restricted funds make up about 1/4 of the total operating budget. Another 15% is derived from auxiliary operations, principally intercollegiate athletics and housing and food service. These funds come in the form of specific payments from customers who are provided goods and services for their payment. And a final 9% comes in the form of student aid from sources that require that these funds be spent on behalf of students. So in the end, the general fund, which this year is $907 million, is what is available for the operation of the university for teaching students. Finally, we get to the general fund. You can see here that 90% of the general fund comes from state appropriations and student tuition and fees. You can also see that the portion that is derived from tuition and fees is more than twice what we receive from the state in the form of operating appropriations. The remaining 10% is derived from several different sources, but the largest is the indirect cost that is recovered from sponsors of research. This is the so-called F&A, or facilities and administration cost. But this other income portion also includes interest income and the administrative cost that is recovered from auxiliary operations like athletics and housing. It is important to note that these enterprises here at Purdue are self-supporting, so neither state appropriations or student education fees are used to support them. It's also important to note that the capital budget, that is the portion of the budget that is devoted to making investments in our physical facilities for repair and rehabilitation, are handled separately. So you don't see repair and rehabilitation as part of this budget. What is included here, though, is the debt service associated with paying the loans that are used to build academic buildings and infrastructure projects the state is willing to support. This small portion of this budget is considered and appropriated separately. So the small slice that's 3% for debt financing is actually a separate element of the appropriation. One thing this chart doesn't show, but I think is worth noting, is that on the expenditure side, 2/3 of the expenditures under the general fund are for salary, wages, and benefits. And that's been an important factor to keep in mind as we've developed budget strategies for containing costs in the future. In November, we had a budget hearing with the State Budget Committee, which is a group made up of legislators and the State Budget Director, who is the head of the State Budget Agency. This group reviewed our budget in preparation for the beginning of the formal budget process, which began in December with the recommendation by the Indiana Commission of Higher Education on a budget for all higher education in the state of Indiana, with a budget recommendation for each of the public universities in the state. And that included Purdue, West Lafayette, and the 3 regional campuses separately. Then in January, the legislative part of the process was initiated with a recommendation by the governor of a budget for higher education in total and for each of the universities and line items in the education budget separately. Since then, we've had a hearing with the House Ways and Means Committee, which is chaired by Representative Jeff Espick of Northern Indiana. They came out with their budget recommendation just last Friday. We're anticipating one more hearing with the Senate Finance Committee, which is chaired by Senator Luke Kenley, and that'll probably take place on or about March 10th. We expect a recommendation from them shortly thereafter, with final resolution of our budget by the end of April, when the legislature adjourns. This next chart is a summary of the stages of the budget from our proposal in August to the most recent budget bill formulated in the House last Friday. In August, we proposed a budget that was directly responsive to the guidance from ICHE. You can see that the proposed base operating appropriation was exactly the same as this year's budget. We had worked on that for a year to get to the point where we would be able to do that. We've been working to develop budget strategies as part of sustaining new synergies that would allow us to operate at this level for the next 2 years, due in large measure to cost constraints and operating budget reductions. Jim Allman will discuss this in more detail following me. The only addition we requested to that was the performance funding, which was in response to the formulae which were developed by ICHE several years ago, that are intended to respond to specific performance parameters that are identified by them. These include various graduation rate metrics, but at West Lafayette, the formula is dominated by a research supplement that is specifically designed to fill the gap in indirect cost recovery that is a product of doing research. So let me spend just a few minutes saying a few words about that. Funding agencies typically do not fully fund indirect costs. And the state contribution that we are asking for here as part of the performance formula is in recognition of the fact that there is a benefit to the state that is derived from the economic development that is a product of the research that is done at Purdue. So we spend that money in part as an investment in the state economy. And in order to double our research expenditures over the past several years, we have had to invest more than ever before. And so we ask for that money in response to that investment. In addition, we proposed a level of R&R that is both consistent with the ICHE formula and our need. And Ken will describe that in just a few minutes. But the commitment we made in August was that if we received an appropriation at this level for operating an R&R, we would not need to raise tuition. That's a very, very important point. And it was a commitment that we made as a product of all of the work that we had done to prepare ourselves for that submission. So as we proceed forward in the near term and discuss everything from further cost reductions to possible tuition increases, I hope that you'll recognize the source of the challenge. With that, let me ask Jim Allman to come forward to describe what we've done to try to meet these challenges in the past several years and the process that will take us to the completion of this budget process. Immediately after Jim, he'll introduce Ken Sandel, who will spend just a few minutes on describing where we are in R&R, and I'll come back at the end to close, and then hopefully have lots of time for the President to come back up. Thank you.
Thank you, Al. I hope this is the same water each one drank on Sunday. Well, as Al talked and described the process, it's very long and it's very complicated. And this morning, what I want to do is spend several slides to try to address the business or the budget development over the next couple months. The fiscal and economic climate has required really a multiple year approach for budgeting purposes. And this slide reflects the activity over the current biennium, but also what we're planning over into the next biennium for the fiscal year 12 and 13. So for a quick look back, on the left-hand side is a list of the actions taken to reduce costs in the current biennium at a time when state operating appropriations were cut about 8%, or $21 million at the West Lafayette campus. We have implemented cost avoidance measures by eliminating salary increases in 2010. We implemented a mid-year merit increase just recently of 1.5% fiscal year 11. There were no supply and expense increases provided for the 2 years of the current biennium. We implemented cost reductions in the form of a 2% budget reduction in fiscal year 2010, curtailed hiring, developed energy saving plans, and suspended special merit. So there's been a lot of activity to manage through this current biennium. During this period, we also increased the base student fees 5% for residents and 6% for non-residents, while acknowledging increasing revenues from administrative overhead recovery from auxiliary units, as well as increased the facilities administrative recovery from the success and growth in sponsored research. The information on the right really describes then our action plan looking at fiscal year 12 and 13. These recommendations were made by the Sustaining New Synergies team. They provide a strategy to provide the projected 67.4 million structural deficit that has received a lot of discussion. Additional details in the full S&S report are available at the Budget Link site, which is available from the Purdue homepage. But the substance of this is cost avoidance measures that will total about $31.8 million and include reductions in what would have been planned salary and wage increases and S&E budget increases while maintaining current levels of strategic plan investments. We are planning on cost reductions of $27.6 million, and these result from a number of activities that many people have been involved in: healthcare costs, continued energy savings efforts, reductions in information and technology expenses, savings from strategic sourcing, changes to the overtime policy, savings associated with the early retirement incentive program, which was offered this past year. So many of these strategies then enable units to then develop their contingency budget plans over the next 2 years. So revenue increases were also included, again, from increases in interest income we're anticipating over the next couple of years, continued recovery from administrative overhead, and then continued growth in our sponsored programs. So if state appropriations are below current levels, then our contingency plans would call for restrained increases in student tuition and fees in order to balance the budget.